All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in. Welcome to those of you just joining us. We're gonna go about 2 minutes here, give everyone a chance to jump into our webinar room. In the meantime, for those of you who are already here, please feel free to use the chat. Tell us, introduce yourself, institution you represent, where you're coming to us from. Always excited to see kind of the wide range of attendee locations on these events. So thank you for being here, and just give us another minute and then we'll be off and running. There we go. Iowa, Colorado Springs. Oh, double Iowa. Look at that. Oh, we got bright and early. Kathy, welcome. Hope you have some coffee with you all the way in Hawaii. I can't even do the math in real time to figure out what time it is for you, but I know enough to know it's early. Hello, Atlanta. Little Pennsylvania. All right, home state. We got some international attendance today. That's incredible. There we go. California, Boston. Carrie, we'll have to figure out if we can get every state represented here on this event afterwards. We'll have to do the analysis.
One of these times. I'm blown away. There's so many people here. This is great.
It's great. Excellent. Well, it's 1:02. Love to see everybody coming in. Please feel free to continue saying hi, institution, location. Again, it's really great to see the wide range of folks here this afternoon or this morning. But I do want to make sure we maximize our time today. So why don't we jump right into it? I have said this before. I will say it every time that I have the privilege of representing Simpson-Scarborough in an event like this. There is no shortage of things that you could be doing with the next 60 minutes of your time. So I am sincerely grateful that you have chosen to spend your time with us today. Today, we're here to present Cutting Through the Noise, a session that we hope delivers clarity to higher ed websites and helps you focus your digital strategy on the metrics and the content that truly influence student decision-making. My name is Steve App. I'm the AVP of Partnerships here at Simpson-Scarborough. I want to take a moment to introduce my co-presenter today, Dan the Man Moore, which is what I call him. You don't have to call him that. He is our senior UX designer coming to us today from snowy California. I am really excited to have Dan with us today because as our senior UX designer, I have found Dan approaches his work through this near singular lens of just how to make websites work better for your most critical audience, which, not surprising to you, but perhaps shocking to some folks on your campus, is not your faculty, actually. I also want to shout out two behind-the-scenes MVPs today, both coming to you from sunny California. Ben Loeffler is our Director of Digital Experience and one of the most thoughtful brains that I've encountered around all things governance, strategy, the goals of higher ed websites, Taekwondo even. And Carrie Barnett is my favorite Director of Marketing, and maybe yours too. More importantly for us, she is the driving force behind putting this webinar on today. So thank you, Carrie, for getting us here to this event. You are going to find Carrie and Ben in the chat throughout this webinar, answering questions, sharing links to helpful resources, and engaging in the conversation. Finally, most of you joining us today are probably somewhat familiar with Simpson-Scarborough, but I never miss a chance to do a little bit of Simpson-Scarborough 101. So for those of you who are maybe just forwarded this event from a peer, first of all, welcome to the Simpson-Scarborough community. Our agency is celebrating its 20th anniversary next year, if you can believe that. We are an agency of 65 individuals with a presence in every time zone in the continental United States, 24 states and counting. And while we are going to talk a lot about the web today, we are an agency with 5 practice areas, including research, media, creative, and strategy, in addition to digital. But enough about us. Let's talk about you all. And I want to set the scene a bit this morning before I pass the microphone over to Dan. And I'd like to do so based on some insights from you and how you feel about the role of your website and its place amongst your strategic priorities. To do so, I want to start by going back in time, a few months at least, to our 2025 MarTech study. Now, we released this earlier this year. It was our second iteration of this study. And as such, we were able to evaluate our results against our 2021 findings. And there were some encouraging signs in that analysis. First, as you can see here, a higher percentage of respondents, nearly 1 in 4, said that their website is a cohesive property with a unified strategy. That was up slightly from 2021, when roughly 1 in 3 respondents could say the same. But I think it's worth mentioning that despite the growth here, this is still less than half of respondents. And that was really a trend throughout this study. Now, within the report, we investigated web strategy, integrations, measurement, governance, accessibility. But I want to focus on the measurement metrics for today, given our topic. And here too, this study showed positive momentum. The percentage of respondents who review their analytics monthly jumped to 37%, and institutions rarely assessing performance went down to 16%. But that still leaves a lot of room for growth in our industry. And I think that there are 2 primary drivers behind this gap. Number one, at most campuses, there are still not established processes in place by which to regularly review analytics. And 2, most campuses still do not have a shared understanding of what metrics matter when it comes to measurement. And perhaps more importantly, what actions can be taken based on those metrics. And we often think about measurement as the end of a process. But when you think about it the way that we do and the way that Dan is going to talk about it here momentarily, you'll realize that these shortcomings, they impact everything from site structure to content to the page structure of that content. But if a refresher of the 2025 MarTech study is a look backwards, I also want to give you a glimpse forward using some relevant findings from our upcoming 2026 CMO study, which will have insights fueled by more than 250 marketing leaders across higher education. Now, this study will be released in full beginning in February, but I wanted to sneak in a few relevant web findings from this study for today because I think they can help us frame the situation even further. So first, I mentioned alignment around what metrics matter most. And here's a dose of alignment. Nearly 3/4 of CMOs ranked growing enrollment as their overall top priority for 2026. What a beneficial compass that is for so many of us who are thinking about how to measure and optimize our websites. Second, now is the time to advocate for greater resources and budget for this important work. That is because 62% of CMOs listed the website among their top 3 Marcom priorities for the year ahead. So again, now is the time. Make that compelling case for what you need to make your website run better. And finally, and I think really fitting when we consider our MarTech study results from earlier this year, 43% of CMOs say that their current website integration across marketing, enrollment, and development is either poor or fair. That was the highest percentage response of all available options to them. So with this data in mind, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dan, who is going to help you all address some of these challenges that we've just gone through by addressing measurement philosophy, thinking about measurement as an ecosystem, not a dashboard, measuring what matters most, not what is most easily measured, and finally, thinking about this work as a cycle, not a milestone. So without further ado, Dan.
Thanks, Steve. So I think when we look at the data that Steve just shared, what we see is a situation in which marketing professionals at every level of the organization desire a website that looks and feels like a healthy ecosystem, functioning well and continuously optimizing itself. But the reality is that most still operate in an environment that looks maybe more like this one, littered by decentralized sites with different technologies and design systems, fragmented governance structures, and split priorities across marketing, enrollment, fundraising, and lacking a centralized source of truth from which to make strategic decisions around who the site is for and what we want those users to do and how to optimize our site to increase their odds of accomplishing those actions. So, why is it important to take a hard look at your digital ecosystem, your website, oftentimes, one of the first touch points of your brand? Well, first, you're putting yourselves at risk if you leave things unattended. Risk comes in the form of decentralized ownership and too many cooks in the kitchen, and the risk of weakening your brand if your website doesn't meet your reputation. And costs. The cost of a site that is decentralized sprawls starts to add up. You have all the teams that need training and management, the wide array of integrations that pile up to your tech stack when left unfettered, and not to mention the maintenance just to keep a big site going. And last is this current moment. There's so much momentum around AI and evolving tech that your teams can greatly benefit from both in reducing friction and optimizing your site for your audiences. We know most of you are probably aware of where things can be improved, but we just want to make sure we say the thing out loud so that you know you're not alone. And that this is the approach that we take to get buy-in from leaders who can affect change for your teams and these large transformations. Ultimately, measurement and optimization are only effective when your site's ecosystem is healthy and we can gather the right insights. If it's unhealthy, like that environment we saw, most of the time it's not just a technology problem or a design problem to solve. Most of the time, it comes back to the site's governance and ownership. If you really want to drive impact, the ownership model, teams, and tools really have to be in alignment. What you're seeing here comes from that same MarTech study that Steve was going through. And most teams or institutions are only at level 2 of their digital maturity. But we know that there are a lot of factors at play here. Resources, both human and financial, leadership goals, and more affect your team's ability to drive impact for your website. Like I said, most teams are at level 2, meaning that you're starting to move beyond the basics, but there's still room to better manage the site and its content and footprint. As partners, we try to move teams into level 3 and 4, where that ecosystem starts to be set up for the user's success, which in turn is your success. When we shift our philosophy from the website being just a tool or a digital reflection of the institution to being the front door of our brand and a source of truth for users, we can start to unlock this better web experience. Ultimately, we need to shift from this idea of output to impact. We all think in sprints and deadlines and launches, though our site is not just an individual item that we're just trying to update or push out. We need to look at this as our main product, not just the news pieces or the little bits of content that get updated. Shifting this mindset of generating output on the site instead to driving impact through it, cutting through the noise of content that doesn't serve user goals and needs. Your website should tell your story, serve your community, and drive enrollment. Everything else to us is clutter. While we love our current students and our faculty, their goals on the website are deep information gathering that oftentimes is even better served in an experience separate from our main institution and enrollment driving platform. Remember that 73% of the CMOs say that they want focus on enrollment as their number one priority. So when we start to break that down and how we redefine those audiences, we look at the primary audiences and we really drill down and consider where they are in their journey and where they are at discovering your institution. Most of the effort in this transformation lies in answering user needs while optimizing journeys and content for these unfamiliar and moderately familiar audiences. This is where the decision making happens. Our very familiar audiences are already experts. They are intimate with the brand and the institution. And while we may not be trying to get those very familiar audiences to enroll, we do need to ensure that they're represented and have the right access to address their needs. We need to give all of these audiences the right information the right way at the right time to help them make the right choice. Based on what we may audit and what insights we may uncover, this helps us to home in on which of these audiences and journeys we focus on. Maybe that's admitted students or your application funnel or your program pages through that experience. So how do we know specifically what we want to speak to? These are our big four questions. Do they have the program I'm interested in? How much will it cost to go here? Will I get accepted here? Can I see myself here? This isn't just something we made up. This comes from Nielsen Norman Group, who is a leader in the UX discipline, and this was their study of higher ed. And these are the four things that are most important to prospective students. So, we're kind of backed and bona fide here by Nielsen Norman Group. If our site is the gateway to our brand, these are the things that the users are coming inside to find. The more we turn up the volume in these areas, the better we cut through the noise and the static of that unrelated content. We have to build on this promise of a centrally managed site for prospective students. In shifting to this mindset, we have to ask, how well is our site answering those big four questions? I can tell you from my experience that if your site is large and decentralized, I bet there are several pathways to an answer, and that may or may not be the same answer across those pathways, meaning that ultimately it's just confusing. There's duplicative content. Some of the content's out of date. It's hard to read. It's bad for AI to read, which ultimately brings us to this conversation around content at large. The key to your success in optimizing your site and cutting out the confusion is going to come down to your ability to create thoughtful and impactful content that tells your story while laddering to those institutional goals. We have to calm this environment. These big sites with sprawling content do far less to answer those main questions than well-maintained smaller sites. The most important thing here is to establish single sources of truth. And when we know what the end state of our content in our site is, that's how we can accurately measure how users find that content, how they engage with that content, and ultimately act upon it, thus allowing us to act upon it. So when we calm that environment, we can start to hear if anything is off key. Content hygiene is really the only way to maintain this kind of clear, consistent, and user-focused web experience. We have to develop, a structure to monitor and clean up our content across the site. We have to be clear. Being clear not only helps users understand, it also helps spiders, search engines, the LLMs to understand. And, in a world where those AI and LLMs will find answers anywhere they can, our site has to be the authority. So how do we conduct good content hygiene? We're going to go through a couple key principles here. One is reducing duplication across the site. We have to avoid this repetitive content that's across multiple different subdomains. We have to centralize that key information around programs, admissions, costs, anything that ladders to those big four questions. And make sure we're preventing any outdated or conflicting versions of content from diluting the answers to that experience. I keep saying it because it's so important. We have to create these single sources of truth. This is one of the few ways that we can reduce that overall content noise and avoid some of those biggest risks, those risk factors that we were talking about specifically when it comes to search and AI. We must be authoritative in those answers that users find, and reinforcing that through our governance model and creating clear ownership to maintain the accuracy of that content. Making sure that we're consolidating and simplifying those pages. We might need to merge fragmented or overly specialized pages that force users to kind of bounce around all over the site and make sure we're sticking to a single topic. Combine any related content and key content types. That's multimedia, links, CTAs, making sure we have one cohesive scannable layout. And then ultimately building these flexible design systems to house more content in fewer places without sacrificing some of that clarity. So with that, I'll make sure we're also going to write for users and administrators, using that plain language that's easily understood by both our users and LLMs, addressing, our users as you, and prioritizing that clarity and relevance over completeness or internal structures. With that, I'm going to shift into a little bit of a case study here. We worked with Sam Houston State University on a major redesign. And one of the biggest issues here was they had a huge site sprawled over multiple installations, 80 different subdomains, and the labor to clean that up would be very, very expensive. And instead, what we decided to do is blow up their site and rebuild from scratch. This is huge. You know, Together we wanted to realize a new experience that really delivered for the site and its users' goals. How that comes to life is in these different structures like focused navigation, right? You can see here these main four buckets ladder up to our key four questions. We have academics, admissions, separating out that cost and aid information, and campus life. From here, we drill down into these different experiences and clean them up. This is looking at the cost funnel and seeing how we have multiple branches and different pathways. This is an example of how we get to that single source of truth by offering straightforward language and to be as upfront and transparent as possible. Because if we're not answering those questions, someone else will answer that question for us. We also make sure, we invest time in stakeholder interviews and speaking to folks on campus. These are specific questions that came up in our discovery with Sam Houston State University from their students. What's the difference between a BA and a BS? What's the difference between a college department and a center and a program? Am I eligible for these campus resources? We need to make sure that the website is answering these types of questions within our content. There was a study earlier this year that found that 46% of prospective students are unfamiliar with the term undergraduate, even. So we have to make sure we're cutting through and speaking on their level in a way that's not tied to the institutional hierarchy. And that comes together in these highly effective and focused pages. In this example, this was focusing on educating prospective students on the college basics within the program page experience. And once we do that and focus the content in that way, these design systems come to life in really meaningful ways that are purpose built for our users to give them the right type of content with the right relevance. And it's also easy to utilize for our page authors as well. So as we shift away from this idea of how we shape content, this is also how we drive the impact of AI through the shape of that content. I know we might all be kind of sick of hearing about AI at this point, or maybe you're on the other side of the spectrum looking for an advantage that you can get from the changing landscape. But regardless of where you sit individually, we need to acknowledge that AI is increasingly changing the way that students are answering those core four questions that I mentioned earlier. Nearly a quarter of high school seniors now use AI as part of their college search information seeking. Only 3% of high school seniors said they used AI for this purpose in 2023. And I bet that number has even increased since this study in August as more students enter their college search. So this study from Halda AI took a look at the types of queries students are asking in their college search, like school comparisons for admission, personalized fit, context and interpretation, and guidance on next steps. Ultimately, AI is changing the way these search journeys happen and having it in one conversational moment so that students can act on these questions and decisions faster. But I'd like to consider these questions that they're asking AI. Do they look familiar? Ultimately, they kind of ladder back up to our core four, and this is how we must shape our content and our user journeys. And when we get into shaping that content for AI, we want to make sure we understand the difference between SEO and GEO, generative engine optimization. SEO is very technical, keyword forward, backlinks. But when we structure for LLMs, we want to focus on the content structure, owning that content and the citations of that content. So we need to leverage our content and our technology to serve both users and the LLMs. And there's some clear ways we can do this to define the content structures. One is just be answer oriented, writing in a clear Q&A format when possible, making the paragraphs complete and human readable makes it AI readable. Structured for comparison, have concrete data and information that when compared to other institutions, you have a clear answer and clear response. Make sure you're offering action and next steps to our users, making sure they have that guidance to interpret the next information on what they should be doing. Be consistently clear, avoiding jargon, internal labels, writing in a very general way that they can understand. Ultimately, writing for humans is being written for AI. When we organize our structure and our content to be readable and trustworthy, the AI will also interpret it and understand it in that way. And last is a bit more technical. We can start to implement LLMs.text. It's very similar to a robots.text. These are clear instructions for LLMs and AIs to help them understand the shape of your content and what's most important. So that said, shaping content for your brand means writing for people first, but making sure it's structured for GEO and AI so that your story is discoverable. AI is advancing at warp speed, but it'll never be able to tell your story or show what it's like to be a student at your institution the way that your own students, staff, faculty, and alumni can. And that's really the massive opportunity in this moment when you're thinking about the purpose of your site and what kind of content needs to be on it. And that's a great segue kind of into our next area of focus on how we measure these things. Websites start to improve when the data becomes a habit and not a report, and what we need to look at. Ultimately, vanity metrics are a trap. And I say this to make the point that GA4 and other SEO tools out of the box are rarely designed for higher ed. Teams are often using metrics that are for e-com instead of the stronger metrics for success for our intended audiences and users. So we need to switch that mindset, right, from impact versus output. How do we start to switch? A lot of it starts with these specific metrics to look at. When I was talking about vanity metrics, these are the items that I mean in that traditional measurement column: page views, bounce rate, average time on page. We might be able to get a couple insights from here, but it's not really driving what our users are looking for and how we ladder them to institutional goals. We can create better impact for higher ed websites if we measure things like apply clicks, visit scheduling, page depth of program pages, percentage of success in completing a specific user journey. We need to make sure that these metrics are tied to institutional goals, user behavior, and brand outcomes. And we do that through a measurement framework. We have to establish these goals. For those unfamiliar, this is a framework that just ensures consistency in measuring success across various campaigns, strategies, and provides information on which metrics matter most. What's most important here is that everything ladders up to those institutional goals and helps provide that North Star for identifying the stakeholders and what success looks like and how we're going to get there. This here is a sample measurement plan and how these things kind of come together, right? We see improve enrollment as a business goal here, and then how that translates to the web experience. We have receive applications, receive inquiries, schedule tours, and what are the specific moments on the site that we can capture to indicate if we're having success here. That's like apply link clicks, RFI form submissions, tour visit form submissions. So we have the shape of the content, but we also have this technical side of understanding how users are engaging with that content. And last, just kind of getting into that general SEO objective, right? Here, we're trying to make sure we are enhancing visibility of the content, optimizing those on-page elements, and leveraging the local SEO experience. Make sure we're driving targeted organic traffic and conducting keyword research. Because if the content is findable on search and on web, it's also going to be findable for AI and LLMs and our students. And making sure that then we can track what those metrics are to drive measurable growth in those experiences. Ultimately, this whole thing is a cycle. It's not just a report or a single item. It's something that we should be constantly evolving and iterating and optimizing. Remember that only 37% of teams are just now reviewing their analytics. We need to be reviewing and optimizing. But all these things work together, right? Content, user experience, analytics, and brand are not just silos. These are every aspect of every piece of the website and the experience that users are finding when they're coming to your site. We have to build this momentum and new growth. And when we start to set up that experience and those ecosystems, then we can move on to like our next steps, like building campaign landing pages and testing different messages, identifying funnels and drop-offs and where people are having difficult experiences and pain points, making those small refinements and seeing how that affects our visibility or the results that we're getting in LLMs, creating this A/B testing and optimizing our content, and tracking those specific events and user behaviors. A healthy ecosystem is built on these structures and turns that data into specific actions And that's the shape of the content, the shape of the website. With that, that's kind of the big breadth of everything here. I'm going to pass it back to Steve to kind of bring it all home.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And let's just wrap up with here a few reminders before we get to some of the great questions I'm already seeing in here, and I'm sure the more to come in. So I think first and foremost, when I was listening to Dan, the thing I was thinking about is that more than any single metric of success with the site, success in terms of measuring the success of our website really needs to be about changing the philosophy about measurement entirely. And I think really hearing Dan, you can have the most sophisticated MarTech stack in your campus. You can have clear governance models. You can have an ambitious web strategy. But if the stakeholders don't understand the why, who are we measuring for? What do we want them to do? What is the goal here? That website, your website, is going to be a free-for-all. So when we think about the why, remember these four arrows and how they build on each other, right? Strategy can set the direction, and governance can help put that into motion. But education is what's going to make it all stick, right? Education is what helps stakeholders across campus understand how the website serves the institution and how they, as website contributors, are responsible for maintaining its integrity, right? The best .edus, they're not just well built, they are well understood. That is how they stand the test of time. And when that buy-in really spreads, that's when we can see momentum really taking off across campus. And once you've addressed that philosophy shift, I think that is when the numbers that you're going to start to see in your dashboards, in your analytics, are going to tell a story that's not just about website performance, but as Dan mentioned with that measurement framework, really about institutional impact around the goals of your campus and what you're trying to achieve from a business perspective. So before we dive into your questions, two quick offers for you. First, we have mentioned our MarTech study a few times today, released earlier this year. If you missed that report, or if you missed the presentation of that report, if you want to grab your copy, you can scan this QR code, which will take you right to the site to get the full report. We've also dropped in, Carrie's faster than I can talk, a link in the chat to that page to get that report. Thank you, Carrie. And then finally, we've talked mostly today about how to orient websites for impact across the industry, kind of writ large. But if you want to understand how to tackle your website without committing to any kind of full web redesign, I'd encourage you to contact me about a website audit. These projects can be very cost-effective, a great way to pinpoint the most impactful optimizations for your site. And I would add, based on some previous deliverables that I've looked at, a really effective way to gain that internal buy-in for the types of transformations that we've talked about here today. We talked about how important that sense of buy-in is, considering the web is a major priority moving forward in 2026. And with that, I want to spend as much time as we can answering your questions. And I'm actually going to start here with a question that I saw come in very early. And Ben, I actually think you covered this, but it's such a good question that I want to make sure we address it live. And that can be you, Ben, or you, Dan. And it comes from our friend Kurt here, who notes that while developing and tuning web content for AI is important, it's starting to feel like this topic occupies an outsized amount of buzz and mind share among senior higher education leaders, AI that is. Many of them probably don't realize the strong web fundamentals are what actually kind of drive AI performance. And so I love this question. How can we reset senior leader expectations and counter this AI snake oil narrative with evidence-based research that kind of demonstrates the proven value of getting the fundamentals right? I love this question because I'm hearing AI every day, and there's a new opportunity for AI, but I'm with Kurt. There's a little bit of noise to this. Ben and Dan, I'm curious if you can kind of address this question here.
I'm super happy to answer it. I think about this all day. lately. Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I do think it's a lot of snake oil, and I think there is research behind that we'd be happy to share. But I think even just speaking from a technical standpoint, right now there is nothing fundamentally different, really, from having strong fundamentals on your content and the way that you approach SEO and the way that you're going to approach GEO. The biggest difference, and I've answered this in a couple different ways in the chat at this point, but there are longer search queries. Like when I'm talking to an LLM, for example, I have like a long, sort of like winding question rather than focused on distinct keywords that I'm trying to kind of trigger through a Google search. And as such, it is great to have like this kind of FAQ Q&A format on pages. That does actually help move the needle because you end up with a distinctly defined natural language question with a concrete answer just beneath it. But realistically, if you do that, you're also going to nail SEO as well. So it's more of a yes and it's not fundamentally different. To the point I think I was making earlier, though, and it speaks to what Kurt was saying about like focusing on fundamentals. We do see this as an opportunity with leadership to focus on those fundamentals. We run so many audits a year. I've been working in higher ed kind of client services on the agency side now for 10 years. So I've worked on more college websites than I could possibly list. And ultimately we see the same thing over and over is that the fundamentals just aren't there a lot of the times. The biggest issues we see are that frankly the teams are stretched far in terms of resources. A lot of the times, the people that are in charge of editing either sections of the site, just one page of the site, they're doing this in the margins of their day. This isn't their main job. Sometimes there is a central team who's doing it, but a lot of the times we see, the dean of a college like being responsible for X amount of pages and things like this. So this is something that's happening on the margins of their day. And ultimately, there's turnover, things drift apart, things don't get updated as often as they need to. And what you end up with, and I think Dan mentioned this earlier in the presentation, is you just have a lot of loose ends. So a student will go to one area of the site, it'll say the due date for this is this date. They'll go to another area of the site and it's a different requirement here. And you end up with a lot of confusion. That, when you're working with an LLM, is going to give the wrong answers. It's also going to give the wrong answers in Google. It's the same problem, right? So that's a big reason why a huge amount of our focus is just refining the content that is there, really, really focusing on the user journeys that are important, shrinking the size of the site so that you've created something that's actually manageable by a small, centralized team, if possible, so that you're mitigating that risk. We look at everything through the lens of risk. So while a lot of this stuff may be snake oil, or at least at this juncture is probably snake oil, people just like trying to get funding and creating a startup from it. Um, we do see this as an opportunity because people are really paying attention to this. And this is something that we've seen people not pay attention to before. So our honest advice here is like, use this as an opportunity to ignite the change that you need to see, because whatever you do, it's going to help. Hopefully that's a well-rounded answer to that.
I think so. I also want to turn to another question that came in because I see this all the time. This is coming from Rebecca, and it's about team size and how to maximize the impact of SEO, GEO. Dan, you referenced the similarities, yet the nuance, and how we actually answer some of those queries based on SEO or GEO. But Rebecca's question is, as a small team, and in this case, we've got one part-time website coordinator on the marketing team, should we prioritize SEO or GEO for the most bang for our buck? And again, I love this question because I think there are a lot of campuses that just don't have as much resources as they would like. And oftentimes these are the campuses that are most tuition dependent and most need to maximize the impact of their site.
I can take this, and I mean, Ben, you can hop in. Um, in that regard, I think what's more important is making sure the website's optimized for your user, because the other pieces fall into place once you have, content that is answering their needs and their questions. The SEO will come naturally, and most universities are big brands, and you already have your regional community members and your regional perspectives who are familiar with your institution and are going to be searching you by name anyway. So what's more important is making sure that the content is squared away and giving the right information in the right way.
Excellent. I'm going to move on to a question that came in from Jennifer because I've heard other folks ask this question before, Ben, Dan, and I think it's so important. And Dan, you presented a little bit of info into the Sam Houston State University process and the fact that we went from a very large, sprawling website, 80 subdomains, to a very focused, I think if I remember correctly, roughly 200-page external facing site with a massive intranet. Question from Jennifer, which I think we definitely need to talk about, is what guidance can we provide for folks around getting internal buy-in for implementing a portal for this internal content? Because we know from experience, many users, especially when we're talking about these decentralized content structures and governance models, they're reluctant to lose their organic search. It might feel like their content is being devalued in this kind of a model. So Ben and Dan, maybe this is Sam Houston State, maybe this is something else, but I would love to hear you all talk about how we talk about this internally with our stakeholders.
Dan, can you grab that? I was in the middle of answering a question in the chat. Sorry.
I was hoping you'd lead in because this is something you evangelize. Ultimately, the buy-in comes from users wanting to feel heard. And what we find with those stakeholders who maybe are losing their place or losing their emphasis is just making sure that we have a response for all of their internal needs. The concept of who moved my cheese, right? Making sure that the cheese is still in the fridge somewhere and they know where to go looking for it. And we do that through portals and having links to the portal and having these really robust resource pages. So it's not that content and that emphasis goes away. It's just making sure that they know that they have all of that information and content at their fingertips. And I don't know if you wanted to jump in more along the side of getting the buy-in from the deans and the leaders. I think that's something that you kind of talk about often when we're engaging with clients.
Yeah. So I mean, we in terms of like, how do we get all of this content off the site and how do we get this into an intranet? One, use this presentation. I think a lot of what we're trying to say here, and again, this was brought up in the chat of like, I have a small team and I cannot, manage all of this external content, right? It is very important to highlight the different levels of risk that I think are involved. There's legal risk, things aren't correct, or you've done some initiative that some administration is going to come after you for. There is a lot of risk to having a lot of content exposed that isn't necessary for what the site is for, which is effectively driving enrollment. I think when we're talking about a main EDU, right? There are obviously other use cases, but it is very important to mitigate that risk in terms of the legal risk and also the risk of having the content be wrong. So we see this a lot, again, where when we're talking with prospective students, for example, we say, did you look at the website a lot? And they'll say, a lot of times they say, no, we didn't. They'll say, we didn't really look at it very much at all. We looked at Reddit, we looked at social media, we wanted to make sure that some of their claims were true. So for example, we were, at Emory University and we were talking to a Black student and she was like, I really wanted to make sure, it was very important to me that Emory was actually representing like how it was going to feel as a Black woman on this campus accurately. She did not trust the website. We also, hear students talking about they look at the website, it was confusing. It took a really long time to get the answers that they needed. So they ended up just sending an email. They just kind of launched off of it. So when you think about it from just the number of resources that you're throwing at a particular area, right? Whether that's somebody who's like on call in enrollment to like answer emails like that versus How do we like make their lives easier and actually have some of this more or relatively evergreen content just available? It's important that we strip out what is unnecessary for those user journeys that we're trying to target, because it's extremely expensive to maintain. It's expensive in that it hurts enrollment. It makes people just drop off and leave and stop the process. Or it means that you're just going to have to hire more people in enrollment on another side of the fence to actually answer questions manually, repeatedly, over and over again. So, what I always like to use is just kind of legal risk and financial risk. I think both of those are pretty effective to leadership. We can show ROI pretty easily in that. Um, but again, it's just think about a lot of sites that we look at are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. And you know what the most expensive part of a redesign is? It's the migration of all of that content. And you know what? Most of the time when we look through an audit, we will come and we will say, most of this content is not necessary. People want to keep it a lot of the times. They're afraid to get rid of it. A lot of it gets, again, we typically don't look at page views, but a lot of this stuff has no SEO value, has no backlinks. Nobody looks at these pages. They're out of date. They're irrelevant to the user journeys that we know we need to focus on, and yet they live on. And it's something that somebody has to maintain. It's something that somebody has to keep alive and make updates to. And on a small team, that's impossible. And that's how we get into these redesign issues to begin with. That's how you end up with a gigantic 10-month, 18-month project that you have to embark on just to update your technology, or just to update, maybe you've gone through like a rebrand, something like that. So again, financial risk. If you have a small, tight, beautiful site that you need a design lift on, it's going to be a lot less expensive and it's going to happen a lot faster.
Ben, would you say that you're passionate about this?
Yeah, I'm so sick of big websites. Yeah.
I want to go to a question I've seen. I'm not going to attribute to anyone because I've seen it come up a couple times. And I know, Dan, we don't have the same level of sourcing as we do for undergraduates, but I do want to bring up the question that you both can address. We've mentioned those 4 most important questions for undergraduate primary audiences. I've seen a few folks asking about if we have any insight or thinking into the 4 most important questions for prospective graduate students, or even just areas where we know there's maybe some nuance between what we shared for undergraduates and graduates.
Yeah, I don't have as pretty or succinct of an answer, but I do have a few points of view. Um, Generally speaking, what we find is graduate students are more concerned, one, with the faculty, who they're going to be studying with and studying under and working for, and then 2, the specific outcomes and the ROI of making that investment in grad school, which is a little bit different than the undergraduate experience, which there's a little bit more vibes and a bit more can I see myself there, whereas the graduate experience is very much outcomes driven and how am I going to be doing this work and experiencing this work.
Very helpful. I want to go to a question that I think is a really fascinating one. This has been rising. It started rising with voice search a few years ago, but we're seeing it more and more now based on artificial intelligence and all the changes that Google is making. In terms of this question around how to best display content for it to be read by AI. And really the question here is, most of the platforms now, they're answering student or user questions that are coming into these search platforms, whether it's on LLMs or traditional, Google or Bing. They're answering that question to the extent that the user doesn't actually have to go to the website, click on the link to get the answer, which makes a lot of that search volume and interest untraceable. So Ben and Dan, really curious to get your take on how you feel about this rise in untraceable search volume.
Yeah, I was just answering that in the chat, so thank you for bringing that up. So I will say first and foremost, if AI can fully satisfy somebody's answers, all of them, without visiting your site, it's very unlikely that you were going to convert them anyways. So we've been talking a lot about like what happens in the age of AI. And I think, we can talk about like the snake oil of SEO versus GEO, right? But there are going to be profound impacts to human computer interaction and user experience overall, right? People are ultimately talking to LLMs a lot more to get these basic questions answered, but those are still really basic answers, right? And I'm going to use, maybe it's a crude example, but I think it's a useful one. Imagine buying underwear purely through an LLM. You're never going to do that. You need to see pictures of it. You need an experience layer in order to make a conversion, right? Ultimately, an LLM is not going to be what makes you decide to buy what underwear. It's going to give you a short list of different brands that people like, just like Google's going to do. It's just going to do that in a more loquacious way, right? And maybe quite a bit more detail. But that experience layer of your site is still one of the most important aspects. And yes, LLMs are changing what we can do with the experience layer, right? Because ultimately, it means that maybe sites do get a little bit smaller. Maybe we do get a little bit tighter with the way that we build things. Maybe there's less mega menus. Maybe we're really focused on designing a really beautiful experience, kind of like when you walk into a flagship store, things like that. But yeah, I think it is a problem of this like untraceability. We don't know who's asking those questions. What's important is that those answers are being asked, one, and that you're coming up in those answers and that those answers are accurate so that they go to your website. But what we don't anticipate is that somebody's just going to say, oh, great, like now I know everything about this college. Because if they got to that point, they weren't going to attend anyways. I mean, the sales ceremony, or I know we don't necessarily like that term, but the ceremony of going through and deciding what university that you're going to go to is a very long ceremony. It's not going to be done through a single LLM session and end there.
Ben Loeffler
And
with
then just
the
to add on,
hard-hitting analogies.
yeah, just to add on a little bit there, we obviously know that the content is like the main authoritative piece, but that also spins out into the more traditional, ways of owning search and SEO. Making sure you're owning your Google Knowledge panel and making sure that's up to date. We've come across so many clients that didn't even own their knowledge panel. So making sure that all of that information that's elsewhere in the world, that's not necessarily on your website, but in these other platforms, is still owned by you and maintained by you.
I want to go to a little bit of a tactical question here, but I know this is a common issue that folks deal with, which involves bot traffic. And the fact Dan, you mentioned metrics that matter, metrics that don't. A question here coming in around the fact that it's hard to filter out some of the bot traffic, which is just creating a lot of noise in an analytics environment. I'm curious what you and Ben would say to some of the challenges that come up from bot traffic interfering with the signal.
Well, some of that is the way you design your explorations. When you set up explorations that are based on, page depths or user journeys, you can start to see where bot data, you can clearly see bots, right? Because they're not exploring in the same way a human does. But I mean, at large, that's just the nature of dealing with analytics and the internet. I don't, Ben, if you have a more details to add there, but that's just kind of my
No, I think
gut
that's
reaction.
good. I think that's good. I think that's good. I mean, it is a difficult, like, and bots continue to be and will continue to be an even worse problem to solve for. But I think what I had said previously is, focusing on conversions and those types of metrics to begin with are going to be better for you anyways. Yeah.
And finally, let's do one last question here as we get close to the end of our time here this afternoon. And again, this is something I'm seeing come up a few times, either in Q&A or in the chat, but it's really coming back to AI, SEO, GEO. We've talked about formatting for these queries, Q&A, declarative answers. Question here just around the idea of what is the right structure on a page in order to answer questions that our users have and create the highest level of visibility with SEO and GEO.
Totally. And I think I'm answering Sharon's question, correct? That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, sir, Ben.
And so And so I
Answer it for the
agree.
world, my friend.
I think Sharon's making some really good points. And I think earlier I said Q&A when I really meant FAQ. Um, so to be clear, declarative headings are better when we're moving through content on a page, right? And often you see this on product marketing sites a lot. It's a very common pattern. You will have an FAQ at the bottom. Previously, before moving into higher ed, I did work in CPG. This is a really common pattern. And often the people who are developing these FAQs are the people who are kind of on the ground. So whether that's somebody who is kind of handling frontline support of monitoring the email of the questions that are coming in. Hey, we've done an audit. We got this question 500 times this cycle, or 2,000 times this cycle. It needs to go at the bottom of this page. That is important. And I think the structure is important as well, as Sharon kind of indicated. We rarely see this pattern on higher ed websites. It is something that you will see on almost every product marketing site and almost no higher ed sites. To have this at the bottom of, say, a tuition page, for example, is super important. And I think bring it back to kind of what Dan was showing earlier in the presentation, if you can recall some of the questions that we had seen from our Sam Houston discovery process, where what you actually saw is it's just a lot of prospective students asking around like some of this, what I would call inside baseball. What is a credit hour? What do these things mean? People use different verbiage at different institutions. And of course, we all know that it means something very specific, but the average 18-year-old does not. And that is where we think that these things are very important. And that's important even for an LLM, right? Because an LLM also doesn't know that too, because that definition shifts between institutions, right? So how are we able to answer that question for the particular institution if they're asking that through an LLM is still important. And I think kind of what Sharon is saying is a good answer to the question. I don't find anything disagreeable with what she's saying here.
Excellent. Well, with that, let's wrap up here for today. Perhaps the most burning question, quick answer, yes, we will be sending out a link to the recording of today's conversation for those of you who maybe joined late, had to leave early, missed us entirely here today. So keep an eye on your inbox for that material later here as soon as that's available. I do want to do one final thank you to my panelists, Ben and Dan, for all of their knowledge today, and to Carrie for all of the work between day one and today and getting us here to share this incredible information with you all. And most importantly, thank you to everyone who is on this presentation today, giving us, again, your time, attention, incredible questions, really, really incredible time spent today. So thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and we will be talking to you again soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank y'all.